This is video number 2 in the series on the respiratory system. So in this one, we want to open up with talking about the larynx and certain parts of the larynx, including this thing called the epiglottis. We want to talk about total cross-sectional area of the airways as we move down the respiratory tract, and then finally spend a little bit of time on the trachea itself. All right, so first off, this thing is the larynx. So first, the hyoid bone is this bone up here. Remember that it's the only bone that doesn't articulate with any other bone. And the hyoid is not considered part of the larynx, but it's included here and labeled to show you this functional relationship that it has. So all this stuff that you see out here, though, in blue is the larynx. So probably the most famous or prominent part is the thyroid cartilage. The thyroid cartilage definitely makes up the bulk of it. You see it here from that kind of anterolateral view as well as the back posterior view. So the very tip, the very front of your thyroid cartilage pops out just a little bit, and that's called the laryngeal prominence. The laryngeal prominence is also known as the Adam's apple. So you're not permitted to say Adam's apple. That's more the kind of layman's casual term for it. But laryngeal prominence is this part right over here that sticks out, and that is commonly called the Adam's apple. This piece of cartilage lies right underneath the thyroid cartilage, and he's called the cricoid cartilage. Nothing to say much about him other than that you need to know his name because he's famous. And finally, these things over here are the trachea itself. Now, probably the most interesting part to talk about is the epiglottis. So the epiglottis is this little flap of tissue. And so this flap of tissue, also seen here from the side, again, there's the thyroid cartilage, there's the epiglottis. What that is, it really is a flap. And so what you'll see is that that flap can exist in one of two states. It can be opened like this, or it can cover over this opening right over here. It can cover over that opening. So there's a hinge-like motion here. So what ends up happening is that when you swallow, and you can try it right now, you can put your finger right on the Adam's apple and swallow. And when that happens, what happens to the larynx as a whole? Does it go up or does it go down? And if you put your finger right over here and swallow, I'm doing it right now, then what you'll see is that it moves up and then it comes back down, okay? So as it moves up, there's a hinge-like function here, and what will happen is that that epiglottis will actually clamp shut. And so when that thing ends up clamping shut, it might look something like, oops, that's not quite right. Let's say it looks something like this, if I exaggerate the view just a little bit, all right? So when that epiglottis clamps shut, then you'll see that the opening to this larynx is actually closed. So why do we have that in the first place? Here's why. So you know that in your neck, you've got two pipes, right? And this is your trachea, and that is your air pipe. Well, this is the larynx, then the trachea. That's your air pipe, but right behind it is the esophagus. The esophagus, we'll look at it another unit, but the esophagus then is the food pipe. So sometimes, you know, you've done stuff like you're taking a sip of your Coke or whatever, and then you start coughing up, and you say, oh man, the Coke went down the wrong pipe. And what you meant by that was that the Coke ended up, some of the little aerosols and stuff kind of went down this way, and then you coughed to bring it right back up. And so these are the two pipes that you have. Now, when you swallow, you do not want food to go down into this pipe over here. Therefore, that epiglottis will hinge shut. That way, when food comes down, it only has one opening to go into, which is the esophagus. So essentially, the epiglottis is going to help you prevent choking. Choking is when you get food lodged in an airway. That is what choking is, okay? So I guess the question I have is, does this mechanism ever go wrong? And the answer is, of course. It goes wrong all the time, right? Which is why people choke and bad things happen from there. Or somebody delivers a Heimlich and that thing, that piece of apple that was lodged here, gets pushed right back out. All right. So, of course, this mechanism can go wrong, but it is there for that purpose. There's the epiglottis. All right. We're going to take kind of a weird view now into the larynx. And what this is showing you is that if somebody inserts an instrument and they view straight down this way, then this is now the opening to that airway. This is the opening to that airway. Right here is the base of the tongue. There's the epiglottis. Remember, we just saw the epiglottis, which is kind of on the anterior side over here. And now there's the epiglottis, and now this is the opening to that airway. What you'll see is there's a bunch of tissue here, and we now have these things called the vocal folds. Now, this opening here is just broadly referred to as the glottis. So here the glottis is narrow, and here the glottis is opened up. So now what this is going to allow you to do, it's going to allow you to produce different tones. And so when I said to you that the larynx is sometimes referred to as the voice box, this is why, because you're able to vocalize as a result of the anatomy in this neighborhood. And so air gets pushed up Okay, so air is coming up and it's getting pushed up north this way. And as it gets pushed up north, we see the vocal folds here. Air gets pushed through an opening, and that opening, of course, is the glottis. And that glottis can vary in aperture or in size. And when you vary that glottis in aperture, it's going to change the pitch. And it shows you here a narrow pitch, a higher pitch is a result of a narrower opening, and a lower pitch is the result of a wider opening here. So how are these things opened and narrowed? Well, we've got some muscles, specifically the names of the muscles and some of the details we don't really care so much about in our current course. But what I want you to see is that when we peel away some of the tissues, this is what we're seeing. We're seeing this thing over here with the narrow glottis, and now with the opening, the opened, wider glottis, because there are muscles that end up moving some of these cartilages, which again changes the aperture here. There's some difference in tension as well on these vocal folds, and cumulatively these effects are going to allow differences in pitch. So does that mean the larynx helps you speak? Well, it is one part that helps you speak. Again, air comes in, and the tone and pitch of it are largely determined by what's happening here. But of course, as you move your way up north, your lips and the shape of your mouth, and how wide open your mouth is or closed, and then your tongue, of course, all those things are going to combine together to help you speak or sing. Okay, so to vocalize. Okay, so where are we? We described the parts of the larynx, and we said, yeah, the vocal folds live there. We talked about the epiglottis. Let's talk about this thing over here now, the total cross-sectional area. Now, this picture is just giving you an overview here, just reminding you of the upper and lower respiratory system. But if we move on and we zoom in, we say, okay, there's your trachea again. Here are my bronchi that break out into other bronchi and then finally into bronchioles and such. What I want you to see is this slide over here. And the main thing, look, you don't need to measure diameter necessarily. I do need you to know, though, the pipes get narrower and narrower. All right, that seems to make sense. Again, we saw that also occurring in the cardiovascular system. And so what ends up happening, though, is that as they get narrower and narrower, I'm going to ask you the same question, though. What is the total cross-sectional area? And we talked about that with capillaries versus arterioles versus arteries, if you recall. So the total cross-section area is greatest. It's actually going to be highest at the alveoli. So the alveoli themselves are the smallest of these different branches. The alveoli are going to be the most narrow. If you look at the diameter, 0.3. And so without a doubt, again, the diameter is smaller. But the thing is, you've got tons and tons of alveoli compared to one trachea, two bronchi, four smaller bronchi, and so on and so forth, a handful of bronchioles, but tons and tons and tons of alveoli all over the place. Therefore, even though alveoli are smaller than the rest of these parts of this bronchial tree, even though they have smaller diameter, you got so many of them, therefore the total cross-sectional area is greatest. So total cross-sectional area is greatest at the alveoli. Why do we care? Well, we care. Look, in the cardiovascular system, when I told you about the total cross-sectional area of the capillaries, I spoke to you at that time kind of in the context of velocity of blood flow, and I told you that blood flow slows through there because the cross-sectional area is widest. But it's also there because that's where things get exchanged, right? The greater the surface area, the greater exchange, the greater diffusion rate can be. Same idea here in the respiratory system. The cross-sectional area is greatest here because this is where diffusion of gases occur. And by rule, the greater the cross-sectional area, the greater the diffusion rate can be. Okay, so that's why the cross-sectional area needs to be greatest at the alveoli. All right, so let's look at the trachea a little bit. Just to kind of get our bearings, we looked at the total cross-sectional area, and let's just knock out these last two learning objectives. The trachea itself is actually made up of C-shaped rings. The letter here, it's a C shape. It's not a big circle. It's actually a C-shaped ring, and it's made up of hyaline cartilage. And so right behind it is the esophagus. And so if you take this bird's eye view down, this is a bird's eye view looking down this way. This is the lumen, or the opening of the trachea. This is my C-shaped hyaline cartilage ring. And on the back of it, again, it's not like it's an empty wall in the back. The back wall of that trachea is really the esophagus. And just to be clear, I'm not saying the esophagus is the same as the trachea. I'm saying if the esophagus wasn't here, this would just be a C-shaped and a big opening. And obviously that's not okay. And so it's covered up by the esophagus here. Like in food pipe, air pipe. Food pipe, air pipe. Now, the next thing is that when you look at the trachea itself, what I want you to see is that there's a whole bunch of mucus-producing cells in there, and it's lined with this pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. That I would like you to know. It's pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And so so the trachea air pipe is made up of C-shaped rings made up of hyaline cartilage. Okay, so now let's look at the ciliated columnar epithelium. When you look at this, remember what cilia are. They're these little projections off the apical surface of epithelial cells made up of microtubules that stick out. And so what do cilia do? They allow things to move along the surface of the cell. So here's what we're seeing. We're seeing that all this kind of yellowy stuff is mucus. And this stuff is dust that's been trapped. Remember that we don't want dust settling down into our lungs because then our immune system freaks out and it creates a lot of inflammation trying to gobble up that dust, and you get pneumonia, and it's just not a good thing for stuff to be trapped down at the base of the lungs or any part of the lungs really. So what we do is that this entire structure is lined with mucus, and what happens as stuff gets stuck on that mucus, what we're going to do is we're going to basically broom it up north. So the ciliated epithelium will brush this mucus up north, as you see me moving my cursor. And so this direction over here, you see that arrow, this is moving up north through the airway. So again, let's make this make sense. What would happen, here's my ciliated epithelium, what would happen if I brush down? If I brush down, then I'm sweeping this stuff into the lungs, which is counterproductive. So I sweep this north. How far up north do I go? As far as I possibly can, at which point we dump that into the esophagus and then you swallow it. So yes, you do end up swallowing mucus every day, and it for good purpose. And after you swallow it, it goes to the GI system, and then you eliminate it. And so we're sweeping this stuff up north. Okay? Now, we do know this happens. We know epithelial tissue has a high turnover rate, and certainly these epithelial tissues are going to turn over and things like that. But we do know for chronic smokers, we do know that your cilia are, number one, not as many. So I guess that's a weird sentence, but you don't have as many cilia on these cells. And number two, they just don't work as well as they should. So what that means then is that this sweeping motion doesn't work quite as well as it should. Now, you may be trapping dust and particulate matter just fine, but now you can't, let me go back here. You can't sweep this up north. If you can't sweep it up north, eventually, gravity being what it is, it works its way down south. And again, that leads to a lot of congestion in the lungs and generally not a good situation. So the point being, these ciliated epithelial tissues are really important to have in these airways. Goblet cells are the mucus-producing cells, okay? All right, so let's see. We have now described the function of the ciliated epithelium in the trachea, and we are finished with this video.